Now that we have a database ready, it's time to start working on the registration logic. As was mentioned before, we already have the page set up for registration, but in this lesson we're not gonna use this page. We're going to create endpoint for registration. So we're gonna write server logic. I'm going to open up Nuxt Hub docs first. Here let's open up Drizzle ORM page documentation. And to be able to simplify interaction with Drizzle ORM, we can copy this content into the file, which we're going to create now. So basically here we are defining use Drizzle function, which we can use to get Drizzle ORM client. And then we can use this client to interact with database. As was mentioned in docs, I'm gonna create drizzle.ts file in the utils folder, which I also have to create within server folder. So right here, let's create this file and paste the content from the docs. And right here, we're basically importing that schema that we have created in the previous lesson within schema.ts file, because we will need this schema to pass it down further into Drizzle function call, which returns Drizzle client. And down here, we're also exporting user type, which will correspond to records in the users table. So it's time to create our first API endpoint, and in Nuxt, we define endpoints within API folder inside the server folder. Right here, I'm gonna create the API endpoint, which is going to handle registration request. I will call it register.post.ts. And the post part in here is the HTTP method that this endpoint is going to work with. That means that if we're going to submit GET request or PUT request to this endpoint is going to ignore it. So we are only accepting POST requests. Now let's start defining this endpoint. The way we define endpoints in Nuxt is by calling define event handler function, which in turn receives another function with one event argument, and whatever we're going to return from this function is going to be used as a response body. Just to test things out, I'm going to return simple string for now. And that's all that we need to do to define and register endpoint, because Nuxt is going to automatically scan all files within this API folder and register API routes for now. And to test this out, I'm going to use Insomnia API client. So right here I have already created new request. I will call it register. Here we need to specify the HTTP method that a registration endpoint is intended to work with, which is post. And now I will write the path to registration endpoint. First of all, I will mention domain name, which in my case is localhost with 3000 port, followed by endpoint/API/register. And if I'm gonna submit this request now, we're getting this error. Probably we need to use HTTP instead of HTTPS. Let's fix it and call this endpoint once again. And we're getting the expected result, string hello. And by the way, if we're going to return JSON from this endpoint, it will be automatically formatted for us in the response body. And now what I'm going to do is reach out to that use Drizzle function that we have defined earlier, which will give us database client, and I'm gonna call .insert method on it in order to insert data to the database, but also this insert method accepts an object which corresponds to a particular table, which we can get from the schema.ts file. We are already exporting this object in here. So I'm going to import this user's object right here, which will correspond to the user's table from the schema.ts file. And now let's pass it down to the insert method. Then we need to specify what kind of data we're about to insert to the user's table. We're doing so by using values method and specifying an object with data where keys would correspond to column names, and values will be the actual values we're going to insert in those columns. So I'm gonna specify 2 columns, email as well as password, and fill them with random data. Then we can also say what kind of data we're expecting to be returned out of this call by using returning method and specifying the following schema. So I want it to return a user object, which will include ID and email properties. Here we're also reaching out to the users object which corresponds to the users table and referencing particular columns on this object. And finally, in order to execute this query, we need to call .get at the end, like so. And before checking this out, let's scroll up and fix the error in this pass. We don't need this extra segment right here. Alright, so currently users table is empty, but the moment I'm going to execute this API request, I'm going to insert one record in the users table. As you can see, this request has been executed successfully. Now if we'll get back to the database, we're seeing that one record has been inserted to the users table, just like we expect to. And to follow the best practices, we always have to hash the password provided by the user. So I'm going to call hash password function, which we don't have to explicitly import. This function is going to be automatically imported, and it comes from the Nuxt utils package. And because this function is asynchronous, we need to wait until it's finished, and also specify this whole closure as asynchronous as well. Alright, and now let's see what is going to happen if I'm going to call this API endpoint once again. Please note that we already have the user registered by using the same email address, so after calling this API endpoint, I'm expecting to receive an error. And that is related to the fact that the same email address already exists in the users table, so I will temporarily change this email address and call this API endpoint once again. This time we'll already have two records in the users table, and please note that the password of the second user is hashed. Let's continue working on the registration logic in the next lesson. A link to the source code of this project will be as always in the video description.